Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, CEO of Boardroom Resources. And today we are going to be looking at part 2 of one of the board risk management challenges, which is deciding, does it make sense to have a audit committee that is responsible for risk, or do we actually think about creating a risk committee? And we had a great debate. If you haven't seen the part 1, you need to watch that as well. But in part 2, we're going to continue this debate. And let me introduce my panel that was so eloquent in dealing with it in part 1. To my immediate right is Cindy Fornelli, who's the Executive Director for the Center for Audit Quality. Cindy, welcome again.
Thank you, TK.
And John Foster, who's the Audit Chair for Masonite International Corp, sits on several other audit committees and also sits on the board of Lear and Chemtura and Berry Plastics and Sabine Oil and Gas. So, John, it's nice for you to work us into that schedule.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so day 1, didn't all agree.
Respectfully disagree.
Right, put the principles out there though. We do agree that there's no one way of doing it. So in that sense, it's tough to disagree when we give that qualifier. But now we're getting down to the heart. We're going to talk about risk committee, audit committee, board owns it as a whole, pros and cons. John, you get to start.
Risk is a critical issue. The board needs to own it and really own it, in my view. And it's much different to me to sit through an hour or an hour and a half on risk as compared to just having a 10-minute summary of what the risk committee did. That having been said, at the risk of sounding a bit wishy-washy, if there really is a lot of granular work to do, if perhaps there's not a good risk process set up, if perhaps there are 3 risks where a lot of follow-up is required, I can see there being need for a risk committee. In generally, I think the board should own risk by itself.
I would agree with that. One thing I will say, though, a practical tip, if you do split it up and put it into a committee, as you must if you are a financial institution in the United States, I think it's critical that there be overlap with the committee members. So if you have a risk committee, there should be at least one member who also sits on the audit committee. So I think having that overlap, if you want to put risk in a committee, gives you a better sense of that holistic approach, which is really what's important, is that the whole board has a sense of ownership and understands what's going on so that it's not siloed and the board can't say, oh, well, that's over in risk or that's over in the audit committee.
Well, Cindy, I have to admit I'm a little surprised. You, of all people, the one that says there has to be a champion of things. If you go to the whole board committee, and I don't care how much time you take with that, if you look at the chairs of the other committees, audit, comp, nom-gov, they are spending hours organizationally, information-wise, in between. There has to be an owner. There has to be a champion.
I agree totally with that. So if it's, let's say it's in the whole board, you still have a board member who's going to be the champion. Or it could be the head of internal audit that's the champion. But somebody who has his or her finger on the pulse of the risk that has been identified by the board. And to John's point earlier, what's the company's risk appetite? So having the champion understand that and having responsibility to communicate, so that way in between board meetings when you're having these 90-minute deep dives, there is somebody who's on point and everybody knows who that person is.
Well, wait, 1 second, then I want to get to you, because that to me is very informal. Okay, the best risk committees that I've seen, and I'm going to want your thoughts on this, John. Best risk committees I've seen has somebody from comp because of the comp risk. So the chair of comp, the chair of the audit committee, the risk committee, and then somebody from the nom-gov, so that the communications to each working committee is very effective. And then somebody has a responsibility formally from meeting to meeting to have responsibility for risk, and particularly for those black swan events, okay? Because I'm an advocate about the strategic planning process. But talk about that type of concept with the communications. And John, somebody being the champion that's more than just a casual champion.
Well, I don't necessarily think that a board of 7 to 9 people has 7 to 9 casual people. So I really do think that a board can oversee risk and do so thoughtfully. If there's one specific risk that's just frightening, perhaps there should be a frightening risk committee, if you will. I don't think drawing up the perfect play means it gets executed perfectly. And so I don't disagree with a person from Comp, a person from Audit, a separate risk committee on a piece of paper. A risk committee is not a panacea. And I think, again, if there's a lot of incremental work to be done away from the typical board calendar because your risk process isn't well established, because you've got one enormous risk, set up a risk committee or set up a committee on a specific risk. But there's no reason, in my view, that a board can't oversee risk itself in this group of typically 7 to 9 people, just like it oversees planning, major acquisitions, et cetera.
And I think the champion is a formal role. I mean, that is communicated to management, communicated to the other board members that TK is going to be our risk champion on the board. We all have a responsibility. We all have to look at this, but TK is going to be our spokesperson within the board in communications with management, in communications with each other, in communications with the various committees.
And let's not forget, let's just pick on compensation for a second. Assume there were 3 people on compensation, 9 people on the board. I think it's fair to say, in general, you're not getting much focus at all from 6 people, and you're getting a fair bit of focus from 3. Maybe if you got focus from 9 people on risk because the board manages risk, that might actually be better than having more focus just from 3. So again, I don't think we should get overly concerned about how we draw up the play. Let's make sure we execute the play really well.
Well, and again, there's all different ways to do it. But following your theory, if that works, why wouldn't you do that with Comp and Audit? If 9 is better than 3, you would do it with all the committees.
I think in those 2 areas in particular, there is a substantial amount of very granular work done between committees for which you do not need an entire board. Let's pick on Nom and Gov for a second, the Nominating and Governance Committee. That's a committee oftentimes with a very short agenda. On one board I'm on, we've rolled into our Compensation Committee. We have a Compensation Nominating and Governance Committee. So again, I think the lesson is, don't be married to any committee structure. You're required to have audit and compensation. And aside from that, do what fits for your situation. Easy to say, but important and difficult to do well.
And another distinction I would posit is that, at least with respect to the audit committee, there is a certain expertise that is needed to really do those deep dives and understand it. And so going back to Jonathan's point, I don't think that there are people generally who are risk experts, but if there is a particular risk that you're trying to ascertain, be it maybe a difficult transaction or a difficult acquisition, then you could create an ad hoc committee to look at that particular risk at that particular time. But risk in general, because there are so many different types of risk that a company faces. There's political risk, there's compliance risk, there's financial risk, there's environmental risk, there's a whole host of different types of risk that you need to be looking at. And so maybe you do a deep dive on an ad hoc basis if there's a particular reason to do that.
Yeah, that sort of supports my thoughts, though. If I'm sitting on a board and there's multiple businesses that are being presented during the planning process, my logical questions to that CEO of that division is going to be, what are the risks, okay, that are associated with your business, okay? How have you addressed those risks, and what risk tolerance do you have in this business? How far are you willing to take this? Because I, as a board member, have to feel comfortable with the level of risk in your particular business. That's, to me, part of the normal strategic planning process. And the only thing that I'm sort of separating into this other thing is what happens in the giant oil spill of BP, or these catastrophic risks that end up being reputational or bet the business kind of deals. But that, and maybe this is why, maybe we're giving a great example of why this is such a challenging topic, and some boards are wrestling with this. Because here's three people that arguably have maybe three different opinions about, how it's managed.
But I think we all agree that one size does not fit all, that it has to be clearly communicated who's going to have responsibility, whether it's the whole board or a committee, that there should be some overlap if you're going to put it in the committee, and that there has to be very good communication and a lot of time developed to talking about risk. I think we all agree on that.
I think that's right. And in your example, clearly understanding the risk appetite and the risk is a component of planning, but I think it's different. I think planning is much broader than risk. It's all about how do I maximize long-term shareholder value, and I want that executive thinking about his suppliers, his customers, his facilities, his people. And so the planning is more of an annual process where risk is something that needs to be analyzed and monitored and attacked constantly. That's why I think they're actually separate but related areas, planning and risk.
This is a fascinating topic, and I think our debate is similar to the debates that are going on, in some boardrooms today. But let me ask you guys, when you look at all this and you look at what's happening in the state-sponsored cyber and the environmental and everything that's happening in the risk space, do you see, when you look in your crystal balls, do you see the structures, or you see the boards doing anything different in the future relative to that? And Cindy, I'll start with you and let John close.
Yeah, basically you're asking me to look into my crystal ball, which I try not to do, but for you I'll do it, TK. I think you are going to see more of a focus on cyber. Whether or not it should be considered another risk, a new risk, it's so much in the news, it's so frightening to people, and it impacts all of these other risks, reputational, regulatory. All of those things come into play if you have a cyber event. So I'm going to predict that you're going to see more maybe standalone cyber committees, cyber risk committees, whether there should be or not.
So I think there will be and should be a more focus on risk. Certainly. There are more risks, they're more dramatic, there's more media, you want to minimize them for all kinds of reasons. I think structurally I don't see much changing. I think it's interesting that in 2013, 8% of the Standard & Poor's 500 had a separate risk committee. In 2014, that was 9%. Let's contrast that with Singapore, where interestingly, the 50 largest public companies all have separate risk committees. Why? Stock exchange requirement. So unless there are legal or exchange requirements, I don't see the structure changing much, and that's fine. I see the focus increasing a lot, and that's a really good thing.
Well, I wish there was more time, because I really appreciate the fact that both of you were challenging and we had the chance to have this debate and we get these principles out. I'm going to be anxious to hear from our audience, how our audience feels about this, and I expect it to be similar to the way we are. I expect them to be all over the place, but I want to thank you guys both for participating in this. I thought it was a healthy debate. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week with a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member, and we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors, Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.